We love the fact that we have Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at the MB Fund, MB Super, co-founder of macrobusiness.com.au. If you want to check out the latest economic news or the important stuff, macrobusiness.com.au. It is in part the work of Leith Van Onselen and others. I'm delighted to say he's on the line. Morning, my friend.
G'day, Luke. Thanks for having me on again.
Oh, mate, it's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. So I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing through the week, some of the reporting, and you and I have talked to this, you've been talking about this forever, me for a little bit less than, but nearly forever. The population issue that, I mean, every 3 years we go to the polls, and I would argue, and I could be wrong, you'll correct me, that every policy setting is impacted by the number of people it either affects or who live here. In other words, population. You never get a population policy put to you. Now, you and I know that. But we had numbers this week that I think are almost, but not quite, indicative of a government that just wants to screw the existing population over. Now, I'll remove my somewhat passionate beliefs and language here and throw it open to you, but the numbers we got for January were the highest on record.
Yeah, mate, look, I mean, honestly, mate, you should be impassioned about this. I think every Australian should be impassioned about this because it's basically forcing people into homelessness and, rental stress. But so the Albanese government, you might remember, end of last year, released its mid-year economic financial fiscal update. And what it said that they basically said to us, look, we admit immigration is too high. We're going to cut it. It's going to be 375,000 this financial year, so to June 30. And then it's going to come down to about 250, I think they said. The problem with it is all the data we've had over the second half of last year in January shows that, if anything, immigration's gone even higher. So, listeners might recall that we set an all-time high record net overseas migration of 518,000 last financial year, so to June 30 last year. And since then, we received the December quarter national accounts last week, and that showed that Australia's population grew by 680,000 last calendar year, which was up from 624 in the financial year. So we don't have net overseas migration data in that, but that tells you that net overseas migration rose. And then we received on Thursday the January net permanent and long-term arrivals data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now, this is basically a proxy for net overseas migration. It's measured, marginally differently, but it tracks incredibly closely. And what it showed is that the January net arrivals figure of 55,000 was the highest January in history, and it was also much higher than January last year when we did 21,000, because January is generally a very small month of arrivals. So we smashed that out of the water. And all it basically tells you is that net overseas migration surged higher than its peak from mid last year. And that this 375,000 target is going to be absolutely obliterated. And, it's just another sign that population numbers are out of control. And it's coming at the same time, obviously, as housing construction is collapsing. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics on Wednesday, I think it was, or maybe it was Tuesday, also released data to 30th December on the number of homes that were added to Australia last calendar year. So that's basically construction minus demolitions. And it showed that we only added 166,000 homes last calendar year. So basically we added 166,000 homes. Our population grew by 680,000 according to the national accounts, which means that we only added one home per 4.5 new residents. So that there, ladies and gentlemen, is why we've got a rental crisis. And if you don't mind, because I'm talking to a Sydney audience, I might as well give you the New South Wales data.
Please do, mate.
And so New South Wales, we only have to 30th of June last year, so last financial year, but the New South Wales population increased by 173,000, which was 100% driven by net overseas migration. Net overseas migration was actually 176 because you lost some residents to other states. It was 173. New South Wales housing stock only increased by 44,000 over the same period. So New South Wales added one home for every 4 new residents. So it's actually a little bit better than the national average, but it's still shocking. And that there is why we have a rental crisis. That's why the rental vacancy rate has collapsed to a record low. I mentioned last week's show that Domain reported a 0.7% vacancy rate, which is an all-time low nationally. PropChack measures it slightly differently. On Friday, they released data showing their own vacancy rates data, which also showed a record low collapse in the vacancy rate to about 1% over the capital cities and 1.1% in Sydney. And this is why we've been reading in the media. There's been, it's all over mostly in Brisbane, there was all these reports about tent cities opening up. But we've seen it everywhere. People having to live in their cars, on the streets, group housing, all this sort of stuff. And it's 100% driven by the federal government's extreme immigration policy. And what every single listener should do, or should think, is they should be thinking to themselves, why is the Albanese government importing unbelievable record numbers of people into Australia without a plan to house them and provide infrastructure? Because we're seeing the direct results here. We're seeing record low rental vacancies, rental rates going through the roof, higher inflation, homelessness, group housing, financial stress.
Now, look, my great-grandparents came here from England. I was born here, but we understand the importance of immigration. And this is not me trying to throw some counter into the argument, because, as you've heard Leith and I for weeks, we have great passion about this topic. This is recklessness of government. That's what it is. And look, there'll be lots of reasons to either support or not support either political party at the next election. But this is fairly and squarely aimed at the average Australian's quality of life. And your share of the pie, because there's more people wanting a bit, is less than what it was. And if you know that by bringing in the people that you're bringing into Australia for whatever reason, it means that you have to come up with new dwellings, and you know at the same time you're building much less dwellings than you used to even before the pandemic, and you know that of the new people coming in, we have a dwelling for each 4.5 of those, and that leaves aside, old mate down the road who's grown up, got a job, lived at home, now wants to move out, get somewhere to rent so they got somewhere to live, and then build a life. Well, good luck to them. This is what's going on, and yet we focus on some of the sexy stuff in politics, but this is an absolute, in my mind, an absolute betrayal of the people. You and I never get asked about it. We are in the midst of big Australia policy writ large. There's no hiding from this. The numbers are out a month or two in arrears, but you can see them there. The government said to you and I last year they were going to reduce the immigration down, and we've got a record month in January. Like so much of what this government said, that is just simply and pure and totally a lie. That's all it is, isn't it, mate?
It is. It's crazy. And one thing that, often it gets thrown back and they say, oh, look, the population's still smaller than it would have been without the pandemic. And they point to the pre-pandemic budget forecast. The population showed that it was marginally higher than what it is now. But I just think that is just such a ridiculous argument, because the supply side isn't what it would have been without the pandemic. So, the problem with it is, especially if you look at housing, but everything, the supply side got absolutely destroyed by the pandemic. So we said hyperinflation in materials and all this other stuff. And we had, long shutdowns of construction sites, all that sort of thing. So this whole notion that, we're just doing catch-up migration doesn't make sense when you haven't done catch-up construction. And that's why we have a rental vacancy rate that's at a record low. So the whole argument's ridiculous. And I'll also just ask, like anyone who's old enough who lives in Sydney, ask yourselves this. So at the turn of the century, Sydney's population was about 3.8 million. It's now about 5.2. It's probably 5.3, but the data's a bit old. Now, think back to the Sydney Olympics in 2000. Do you think Sydney's quality of life was better back when the Sydney Olympics was on, around about that time, than what it is now? And I guarantee if you're old enough, probably 9 out of 10 of you at least would say, yes, it was a lot better back then. And the prime reason why it's worse now is because we've added, 1.5 million people roughly in a very short period of time. And it's basically created, capacity constraints everywhere, not just in housing, but infrastructure. And now if you want to drive around Sydney, you used to just pay a toll if you went over the bridge or under the bridge or near the airport. Now there's basically toll roads everywhere.
Yes.
So if you need to drive anywhere in Sydney now, you've got Transurban basically pulling money out of your wallet.
Yeah.
It's also robbing the state budget now, because the state government's now trying to do some rebates for your tolls you got to pay, which then goes straight to a private company.
Yes.
20 years ago, you didn't have to do this stuff.
Yeah.
But you're only doing it because the federal government's fire hose record numbers of people into Sydney. And then obviously you've also had to deal with privatisations of everything because the feds collect 80% of the revenue from immigration mostly through personal income tax and corporate tax. The states get squeezed because they've got a very narrow tax base, and then they end up selling everything. So then you pay higher user pays on everything because they've sold everything, whether it's your land registry, your ports, whatever. You're doing public-private partnerships on roads, so Transurban builds everything, then fleeces you. So there's no doubt about it. Sydney-siders and Australians more generally are worse off out of this, especially if you live in a major city.
And you and I have been talking there about dwellings. That leaves aside, as you always say. What about places in schools, in hospitals? What about jobs? What about roads? What about public transport? What about? There's all these other things that we rely on right now for our quality of life that must be eroded because they don't add that. Their only conversation is about adding dwellings. Do you see them saying, and we're going to need to build 3 new public hospitals because our population grew by 100,000 people this year? You'd never hear that stuff.
No, and they always just stretch the existing infrastructure longer, which makes it, basically a lot worse. And then I'll tell you the next battlefield, Luke, over the next sort of 20, 30 years is going to be water supply. I mean, we know that Sydney, Melbourne, basically all down the East Coast is pretty much, and probably South Australia as well. And Western Australia's got this problem as well. They're all basically structurally short of water. Now, we've obviously had a 3-year La Nina where we had, historically high rainfall, but that's not going to last. And as you just keep piling more and more people in there, you're going to have to find water supply. So they're going to have to build more desalination plants, and they're going to find a way to truck it, build pipelines underground, under houses and everything, infrastructure, all the way into, Western Sydney, which is where they're dumping most of the migrants, to somehow pump the water uphill from the coast into Western Sydney, which is going to cost, tens of billions of dollars, which just means everyone's water bills are going to go through the roof, when a lot of this could be avoided by just not bringing the people in the first place. So you don't create the demand problem. And that's just another area where we're going to get fleeced.
And the other point, and I want to get to GST, so if you can briefly answer this for me, because people say, why expand the population? What's the government doing by increasing population like this? It's getting fake growth. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's getting fake growth. A lot of it expands the overall economic pie, which means that Australia avoids a recession, even though we go backwards in per capita terms. But the other main problem is, Luke, the federal government sets the policy. They collect all the gains from immigration through income taxes. They collect 80% taxes, whereas the costs are deferred to state governments and you and I through toll roads and lower living costs and higher user pay. So we've got a misalignment of incentives, and that's why the federal government loves it.
Now, the Victorian Treasurer, Tim Pallas, was out and about yesterday speaking about the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, obviously a man who regularly goes to Bunnings. Have a listen.
The mathematically challenged New South Wales Premier, might I say. He might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but he is a tool. He has totally got the GST breakup wrong.
Now, you're a Victorian. Have New South Wales been dudded in this GST distribution? Yes.
Yes, so Tim Pallas is an absolute flog. That's all I can say. The Victorian government down here is an absolute disgrace, right? They are heavily indebted, the most incompetent pack of morons you'd ever likely see. They've basically, bloated the public service like you wouldn't believe, had the biggest growth in bureaucrats, massive wages bills, hugely inefficient infrastructure build that's just always bloated out of, way over budget, costing billions of dollars. So Victoria's heavily in debt. It's forecast to go even more heavily in debt. We've got the lowest credit rating in the country. It's a basket case. Now, what the GST distribution basically did was it gave Victoria $3.9 billion extra. It robbed New South Wales of $188 million. Now, on one side, obviously New South Wales and Victoria are getting the lion's share of migrants, and we've talked about this vertical fiscal imbalance where the feds collect most of the money and the states get dudded. Basically, so the feds should be giving those two states more money to basically, if they're going to flood them with people, they need to give them more money. The problem with this is, why has New South Wales been dudded by $200 million? Because New South Wales received 176,000 net overseas migrants. Victoria received 154,000.
Right.
So why has New South Wales been dudded? Now, there is an argument about, Western Australia's been lucky because it's got massive resource wealth, et cetera, and that sort of thing. And Western Australia received another 800 million, which is probably, shouldn't have happened. But if we're comparing Victoria and New South Wales has 100% been dudded. They got 200 million ripped out of them. Victoria, because of their incompetence, got an extra 3.9 $8 billion. And that's just wrong.
Yeah.
But there is a broader issue. if you don't mind me quickly saying, like,
Yes.
I talk about this vertical fiscal imbalance. Now, one of the areas where the states get revenue, obviously, it's the main area is the GST. The GST is a shrinking tax base. The reason for that is it doesn't grow as quickly as household consumption because things like healthcare, spending on fresh food, etc., is excluded. And healthcare is the fastest growing component of household expenditure. So what it means is that the states are fighting over diminishing pie in a relative sense, whereas the federal government, through personal income taxes, enjoys the fastest growing pie in terms of tax revenue. So again, it's what we need is really root and branch tax reform that gives the states more money and allows their budgets to grow in line with population growth. But unfortunately, so we've left in this situation where they fight over this diminishing pie every year, while the feds increase their costs through flooding them with extra people to provide services and infrastructure for.
Yeah.
And the feds laugh all the way to the bank, so they collect more personal and company taxes for them. So that's kind of the macro view of why the whole system's broken.
Yeah.
But that being said, New South Wales, yes, has been dudded, and Tim Pallas from Victoria is a tool.
Macrobusiness.com.au. Thank you, Leith, very much indeed, mate. Talk to you next week.
Thanks, Luke.